Hello everyone, my name is Ariana Larkin, and today I'm going to teach you a little bit about competence to plead guilty. I will start by saying I did include a lot of information in this PowerPoint, so I might go a little bit fast just to get everything in the time limit. Okay, before we get into our main topic, I want to do a little bit of a refresher. So last module, we went over competence to stand trial and the term competence to proceed. But this module really highlighted these two specific competencies that are required for different situations in legal proceedings. The first up, we have adjudicative competence, which places an emphasis on factual and rational understanding of the trial process. We learned that this is based on the Dusky standard. We also know that this covers the basic ability of participating and assisting in one's own defense, but that doesn't automatically or necessarily guarantee or mean that they can evaluate their legal options and make rational choices. So this shift from understanding and participating to actually making a choice and waiving rights is where decisional competence comes into play. So what this does is places an emphasis on a defendant's autonomous decision making. And these two are pretty closely related terms, and I just wanted to add a good way to remember how each apply to a specific situation is that decisional competence doesn't necessarily seek to enhance accuracy, but mainly protect autonomy. Okay, so now that we've got the basics down, we can start talking about our actual topic, which is the guilty plea. And now this is a specific situation that requires decisional competence, like we just talked about. And what this is the admission by a defendant that they are guilty of their charge. And so a couple things about this: over 90% of cases are resolved through a guilty plea instead of going to trial. And this plea must be knowing, intelligent, and voluntary. So based on that, the Supreme Court decided that a knowing plea actually required that a defendant understand at least three aspects of the criminal process, which you can see on the right. I included a quote from our text. And the process of this is pretty much to just make sure that the attorney has determined that this plea, this guilty plea, is in the defendant's best interest, but also he's explained to the defendant the consequences of doing so. And ultimately, a judge is going to make this determination on the record at a plea hearing, and this is referred to as the arraignment. Okay, so now we get to talk a little bit about the main question behind the guilty plea. And this is, does the person or defendant pleading guilty need to be more competent than a person or a defendant going to trial? And last slide, we touched a little bit on the Supreme Court's requirements to plea. But one thing I think we really need to keep in mind is that the defendant needs to really grasp the consequences of waiving their rights. And this brings me to the two cases that shaped this specific competency or situation. First, we've got Sealing versus Eamon. And the reasoning behind this whole case is pretty much not only does the defendant need to understand their charge and the consequences of their charge, but like I said, the consequences of letting go of their rights. And now the argument here is that the degree of competence needed to make the plea valid needs to be higher than the degree necessary for the competence to stand trial. As we know, later on, this standard ends up getting rejected in Godinez versus Morin. And the primary reason that this happened is because the court notes that in both cases or situations of standing trial and pleading guilty, the defendant needs to be able to decide whether to remain silent, confront accusers, or waive their right to a jury trial, etc. So there needs to be a similar level of competency there. And before moving on, I just want to include that the jurisdictions following this case of Morin, which is actually most states and all federal jurisdictions, the evaluators that do the assessing for the competence don't actually need to adjust the standard of competence based on whether the defendant is going to plead guilty or go to trial. So, because the competence standard doesn't need to be adjusted, how do we make sure that the defendant is actually competent in all the necessary areas? We can use the MacArthur Competence Assessment Tool, which is an instrument pretty much designed to examine competence-related abilities. And as you can see here, it's administered like an interview, lasts between 25 and 45 minutes, and it measures understanding, reasoning, and appreciation. And why is this tool ideal? Ultimately, it's going to give the examiner a better look into why the defendant is choosing to plead guilty and pretty much allow them to make the determination if the reasons are rational. And this is going to then help the court make the distinction between the question if the defendant's plea is knowing and voluntary, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Okay, now we can take a look at an example. I've included the link to this video. This is the case of Michelle Blair. This took place back in 2015. Blair was charged with abusing her 4 children and killing 2 of them. So 2 doctors determined Blair competent to stand trial. Blair then decided to plead guilty. However, the judge, Judge King, did not accept the guilty plea at the time, as the court was still waiting on one final report. If you go to about 2 minutes into the video, you will see a clip of Blair being asked if she understands the consequences of pleading guilty to a first-degree murder charge. She does confirm that she understands, and she then continues to waive her right to a preliminary exam. But I will say that something of importance in this example is Dr. Shiner's statement that there is a mental disturbance present, and that's actually going to lead us into our next slide. Okay, so now we get to talk about whether or not a mentally ill person can plead guilty. Mental illness is an aspect considered in psychological evaluations that assess competency, but it's not taken alone. Like the determination isn't sole. It's actually taken in conjunction with other aspects like cognitive ability or communication skills. So in order for a defendant to be deemed incompetent to plead guilty, their mental illness or disability must hinder their ability to understand and participate in their trial, as well as interfere with their ability to make rational choices. And here I've included another video. This one is actually completely optional, but this is attorney Roger Foley, and he just goes over how mental health plays a role in competency. I chose this video specifically because he goes over what happens when someone is found incompetent. And I know we did already talk about that, and basically what happens is the defendant is allotted restoration time before they must appear before the court again. But Foley just gives some pretty good insight on when cases actually get dismissed, and he offers a new perspective on kind of like the defendant's side. So last but not least, we're going to talk about the role of the evaluator. And I know it's pretty self-explanatory and we got bits and pieces throughout the PowerPoint, but I just want to make sure everything's understood. So first, we are going to inquire why the defendant wants to plead guilty. And now this is something we figure out right off the bat. Second, we are going to assess decisional competence, which is the autonomy decision-making that we talked about in the beginning. Third, we need to filter out irrational reasoning. Now, this could be psychosis, schizophrenia, anything making their choice to do this not accurate or rational. Fourth, we are going to decide if the plea is knowing, and this is going to be based on reasoning. And finally, we will evaluate if the plea is voluntary, and this is important, especially in plea bargaining. Now, we shouldn't forget that in all cases, the evaluator needs to describe the defendant's reasoning and any possible vulnerabilities to pressure. This can be internal or external, but also we need to remember that it is the judge, not the evaluator, who decides if the plea is too pressured to be considered voluntary. Okay, here's our discussion question. Based on what you've learned so far, was the Supreme Court just or flawed in its decision to reject the more competent rationale endorsed by the Ninth Circuit in Sealing v. Amon? Further, understanding that decisional competence is distinct from adjudicative competence, is it fair that the standard of competence does not need to be adjusted based on the defendant's choice between proceeding or pleading guilty? All right, and here are my references. Thank you so much, and I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope that this was as insightful for you as it was for me.